I walked out of my house at 7:12 in the morning, coffee in hand, still half asleep, and for a second I thought I was looking at the wrong house, like maybe I'd stepped into someone else's driveway by accident, because where my driveway used to slope cleanly down to the street, there was now a smooth, perfect slab of gray concrete sealing it off like a tomb. No warning tape, no cones, no sign, nothing, just solid, cured concrete blocking my garage like it had always belonged there. I stood there for a full minute, not moving, just staring at it, blinking, waiting for my brain to catch up with what my eyes were seeing, and then it hit me. They actually did it. The HOA didn't just ignore me. They went ahead and poured concrete across my private property overnight. Now, I live in one of those planned communities, the kind with clean sidewalks, trimmed hedges, and a board that likes to remind you they maintain standards. And sure, they handle shared stuff, streets, drainage, landscaping, but my driveway? That's mine. It's in my deed, clearly marked, no easement, no shared use, no gray area. It's as private as my living room. 3 months earlier, the board had announced they were extending the sidewalk along our street, which, okay, fine, I'm not anti-sidewalk. But I noticed something right away. The planned extension ran straight across the front edge of my driveway apron, which, again, sits entirely on my property. So I did what any reasonable adult does. I documented it. I sent a formal email, attached a copy of my deed, highlighted the boundary lines, and spelled it out in plain English. Any work touching my driveway requires my written consent. I wasn't rude. I wasn't aggressive. I was just precise. And then I got a reply from the board president, not even addressing my points, just one of those cold, dismissive responses that tells you exactly how they see you. His name was Darren, mid-50s, former corporate guy, the kind who thinks a polo shirt counts as authority. And his email said, "This is a community improvement project, and individual objections do not override board decisions." That was it. No acknowledgement of the deed, no discussion, just power talk. And right there, I knew what this really was. It wasn't about sidewalks. It was about control. See, Darren had a reputation in the neighborhood, not loud, not aggressive, but quietly territorial. The kind of guy who doesn't argue. He just proceeds, like the outcome is already decided. And I'd pushed back, politely, but firmly. And in his world, that's not something you ignore. That's something you correct. So I responded again, more formally this time, attached the same documents, referenced property law, and made it clear any unauthorized construction on my land would be considered trespass and subject to removal. And then silence. Weeks went by, no follow-up, no meeting request, nothing. And honestly, I thought maybe that was the end of it. Maybe they adjusted the plan. Maybe someone on the board actually read the documents and realized it wasn't worth the risk. Turns out, they just waited. They waited until a random weekday. No notice, no heads up, no permit posted anywhere, and they sent a crew in before sunrise. By the time I walked outside, it was already done. The concrete had been poured, leveled, and left to cure, fused seamlessly with the new sidewalk like it had always been part of it. It wasn't sloppy work either. It was clean, deliberate, measured, which somehow made it worse, because this wasn't a mistake. This was planned. I walked down to the edge, crouched, ran my fingers along the seam where my driveway used to meet the street, and it was gone. Just gone, replaced by a smooth barrier that made my garage completely inaccessible unless I wanted to drive over fresh concrete and destroy it myself. And that's when the second realization hit. They weren't just building a sidewalk. They were testing me. They were betting I wouldn't fight it, that I'd complain, maybe send a couple emails, but ultimately comply. Because that's what most people do with HOAs, right? They assume the board has more power than it actually does. They don't want the hassle. They don't want the legal fight. So they just adapt. But here's the thing. I don't like being cornered, and I definitely don't like being ignored when I've already done the work to make things clear. So I went back inside, set my coffee down, grabbed my phone, and started documenting everything. Wide shots, close-ups, timestamps, angles showing the property line, everything. Because if this was going to turn into a fight, I wanted the record to speak for itself. Then I called the county building department, and that's when things got interesting. I gave them the address, described the situation, and asked one simple question. Was a permit pulled for this work? There was a pause on the line, keyboard clicking, and then the answer. No, We don't have any permit on file for that address. I actually smiled when I heard that, not because I wanted to fight, but because now it wasn't just my word against theirs. Now it was a code violation. I thanked them, hung up, and immediately drafted a certified letter, formal, precise, unemotional, stating that unpermitted construction had been placed on private property without authorization, and that I expected full removal within 72 hours. Not a request, a deadline. I printed it, signed it, and sent it off that same morning. And then I waited. That afternoon, my phone rang, unknown number. I answered, and sure enough, it was Darren. His tone wasn't angry. Not yet. It was that controlled irritation, like he couldn't believe he even had to make the call. He said, "The concrete has already cured. Removing it would be unnecessarily disruptive, and frankly, you're being unreasonable about this." I leaned against the counter, looked out the window at that gray slab blocking my driveway, and just let him finish. Then I said, calmly, "I'm not interested in your opinion. The deadline stands." There was a pause, a longer one this time, and I could practically hear the shift on the other end, that moment where someone realizes they're not dealing with compliance anymore. He didn't argue, didn't threaten, just said, "We'll review the situation," and hung up. And that was it. No follow-up, no action, no crew coming back to fix it, just silence again. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like they were calling my bluff. And the thing about that is, I don't bluff. All right, let me pause the story for a second, because this is where most people get tripped up, and honestly, it's exactly what guys like Darren are counting on. According to standard procedure in most U.S. jurisdictions, any structural modification, and yes, pouring concrete absolutely counts, requires a valid permit, especially if it affects access, drainage, or property boundaries. That's not optional. That's baseline compliance. So the moment I confirmed there was no permit on file, this stopped being a neighbor dispute and turned into a code enforcement issue, and that changes the entire power dynamic. Now, from a legal perspective, HOAs don't magically override property rights. They operate within a framework, bylaws, CC and AMP, RS. But those documents don't give them the authority to physically alter privately deeded property without consent, unless there's a clearly defined easement. And in my case, there wasn't. Zero. So what Darren was doing wasn't just overreach, it was exposure, legal, financial, and administrative. But here's the part people miss. This wasn't just about law, it was about psychology. This is a psychological trap a lot of boards fall into, especially when they've gone unchallenged for a while. They start to assume compliance is the default, that homeowners will grumble but ultimately fold, because conflict is inconvenient. So they escalate just enough to force a reaction, and then they wait. If you hesitate, if you negotiate too early, if you show uncertainty, they interpret that as weakness. And once that perception sets in, you're not negotiating anymore. You're conceding in slow motion. The key move here was the deadline. Not emotional, not aggressive, just clear, documented, and backed by evidence. Because once you anchor the situation in procedure instead of opinion, you're no longer arguing, you're enforcing. And that's a completely different game. So the 72-hour deadline came and went. No crew, no email, no apology, not even a half-hearted attempt to review the situation. Just silence, the kind that's supposed to make you second-guess yourself, like maybe you overreacted, maybe it's not worth pushing further. Yeah, that kind of silence doesn't work on me. Because by that point, this wasn't about concrete anymore. It was about precedent. If I let this slide, I was basically giving them permission to treat my property like a suggestion. And I don't do that. So at exactly 6:30 in the morning on day 4, while most of the neighborhood was still asleep, 2 trucks pulled up in front of my house. One from a licensed concrete cutting company, the other from a structural contractor I'd worked with before, both fully insured, both very aware of what we were about to do. No drama, no yelling, no confrontation, just execution. The crew stepped out, took one look at the slab, and I handed them the property survey, highlighted, clean, undeniable. One of the guys nodded, ran his finger along the line, and said, "So we cut right here." I said, "Exactly there." And that was it. No debate, no hesitation. Within minutes, the saws fired up, that high-pitched, metallic scream cutting through the quiet morning air, echoing down the street like an alarm clock the HOA didn't set. And I'll tell you something. There's a certain kind of satisfaction in hearing concrete being undone, especially when it never should have been there in the first place. They made a precise, straight cut along the exact boundary of my property, not an inch over, not an inch under. Clean, surgical. Then they broke apart the section that had sealed my driveway, lifted it out in chunks, loaded it onto the truck, and just like that, the barrier was gone. My driveway was open again. But I didn't stop there, because removing the problem isn't the same as closing the loop. The contractor reshaped the edge, reinforced the transition point, made sure the integrity of both my driveway and the remaining sidewalk was intact, because I wasn't about to give anyone an excuse to say I caused damage. Everything we did was by the book, documented, permitted, compliant. Oh, and yeah, about that permit. I filed one. Not because I needed permission to fix trespass on my own property, but because I wanted the record to be airtight. So now, on paper, it showed that corrective work had been done to resolve an unpermitted installation. That matters. By noon, the job was done. Clean, smooth, functional, like nothing had ever happened, except now there was a very clear line, visually and legally, between my property and theirs. And then came the part Darren definitely didn't plan for. I compiled everything. Invoices from both crews, cost of debris removal, labor, the permit application fee, documentation of the code violation, timestamps, photos before and after, all of it. Organized, itemized, impossible to argue with. And I sent it to the HOA. Not as a complaint, as a bill. Just over $6,000. Payable by the association. Because here's the thing. When an entity causes damage or incurs cost through unauthorized action, they're responsible for remediation. That's not personal, that's liability. And HOAs? They don't pay out of pocket, they pay out of the association fund. Which means every decision like this hits the entire board where it actually hurts. Accountability. Now, I didn't expect Darren to call me and apologize. That's not his style. But 2 weeks later, I did get something, a letter. Not an invoice dispute, not a legal notice, just a strongly worded letter. The kind that tries to sound official without actually saying anything actionable. It talked about community cooperation, shared responsibility, and how my actions were disruptive to neighborhood harmony. Yeah, that kind of language. I read it once, smiled a little, and then forwarded it straight to my attorney without adding a single word. Because at that point, I wasn't in a conversation anymore. I was in a position. And positions don't argue, they hold. After that, nothing. No follow-up. No escalation, no board meeting drama, just quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you the message landed exactly where it needed to. And the best part? Every morning since then, I walk out with my coffee, same time, same routine, and my driveway is exactly where it should be. Open, untouched, respected. No new concrete, no surprise projects, no community improvements creeping over the line. Because once you establish a boundary, not just physically, but procedurally, people remember, especially the ones who thought you wouldn't enforce it. So what's the actual takeaway here? Because yeah, it's a satisfying story, there's a clean ending, a little bit of poetic justice, but if that's all you get from it, you're missing the part that actually matters. The lesson here is not fight your HOA over everything. It's not be difficult. It's not even win at all costs. The lesson here is understanding where authority actually ends, and where your responsibility to enforce your own boundaries begins. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people don't lose situations like this because they're wrong. They lose because they hesitate. They assume the system is more powerful than it really is. They assume the board knows better. They assume pushing back will make things worse. And that hesitation? That's exactly what allows overreach to happen in the first place. Now, according to standard procedure, HOAs are supposed to operate within clearly defined limits. They manage shared spaces, enforce agreed-upon rules, maintain consistency, but they are not sovereign entities. They don't get to rewrite property lines, they don't get to bypass permits, and they definitely don't get to ignore documented ownership just because it's inconvenient to their plan. But here's where it gets subtle. From a legal perspective, none of that protects you automatically. The law doesn't jump in the moment something goes wrong. It responds when you activate it, when you document, when you report, when you create a record that forces the system to acknowledge what happened. And if you don't do that, then what you have isn't a violation. It's just a situation that slowly becomes normalized. And that's where the psychological side comes back in. Because this is a psychological trap that plays out in neighborhoods all over the place. Small oversteps, justified as improvements, pushed through quickly, banking on the idea that no one will want to deal with the hassle of pushing back. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's just momentum. Sometimes it's ego. Sometimes it's a board that's gotten a little too comfortable making decisions without friction. But intention doesn't really matter when the outcome crosses a line. What matters is whether that line holds. And that's on you. The moment you see something that doesn't sit right, something that contradicts your documents, your rights, your agreements, you've got a choice. You can question it early, calmly, with clarity, or you can wait until it's already done and hope it sorts itself out. One of those paths gives you leverage, the other gives you stress. And look, I get it, not everyone wants to hire crews, file complaints, deal with paperwork. That's not the point. The point is posture. It's how you respond in the first few moments when something crosses into your space. Do you treat it like a misunderstanding that needs clarification, or do you treat it like a boundary that needs reinforcement? Because people and organizations take cues from that. If you're vague, they'll push. If you're emotional, they'll wait you out. But if you're clear, documented, and consistent, they adjust. Not because they suddenly agree with you, but because the cost of ignoring you becomes higher than the cost of respecting you. And that's really what this whole thing came down to: cost. Not just the $6,000, but the administrative headache, the exposure, the realization that the next time they try something like this, it won't be quiet, it won't be easy, and it definitely won't be free. So yeah, my driveway is clear now. But more importantly, the expectation is clear. And that's something you can't pour overnight. So let me ask you this. If you walked outside tomorrow morning and found your access blocked, your property altered, your space quietly taken over, what would you do in that moment? Would you question it, or would you enforce it?